What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Thursday, January 26th. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay, guys, let's take a look at this 6-game NBA slate tonight. And pretty awesome night last night. All of our picks hit. I think with the exception of one pick that scored like 30 fantasy points and didn't hit value. All of the other plays, all the other picks from yesterday's video did really well. So let's keep it going. Usually when I say that, usually the day after my picks are good, the picks suck. So good luck today, guys. Let's hope we can do it back to back. So at the point guard position, I like Malcolm Brogdon from the Boston Celtics playing the New York Knicks, who have a middle of the pack defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Now, Malcolm Brogdon is back from injury, and Marcus Smart will be out for a couple weeks, so Malcolm Brogdon should get plenty of minutes here tonight. He's averaging 27.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 24 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. Now he's projected at 27.5 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 32 fantasy points or more and get you 5 times value or more. He's $6,000 DraftKings salary, $200 less on FanDuel. So I love that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 227 points scored in this game. And Malcolm Brogdon, he scored 39 fantasy points in his last game that he played, playing 34 minutes. Now that was 3 games ago. He's been out for 2 games, but he's back tonight. And he should get plenty of minutes and a big usage rate. So I like Malcolm Brogdon here versus the New York Knicks. Another point guard that I like is Spencer Dinwiddie from the Dallas Mavericks playing the Phoenix Suns, who have a good defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing point guards. Spencer Dinwiddie has averaged 31 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 21% usage rate. He's projected at 30.9 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. He's $6,400 DraftKings salary, $400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 225.5 points scored in this game. And Spencer Dinwiddie has scored 34, 37, and 27 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 35, and 30 minutes. And he's got a pretty good track record here versus the Suns. He scored 35, 25, 43, and 24 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Suns. So I like Spencer Dinwiddie here versus the Phoenix Suns. Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. I like Norman Powell from the LA Clippers playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Norman Powell has averaged 25.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 26 minutes per game with a 26% usage rate. He's projected at 25.2 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 30 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. He's $5,800 DraftKings salary, $600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game. And Norman Powell has scored 34, 26, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 25, 30, and 26 minutes. So Norman Powell, the reason that I like this pick, he scored 36, 36, 26, 25, and 28 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Spurs. Also, in his last 3 out of 4 games, he scored over 34 fantasy points. So he's been catching some fire lately, and he's been playing pretty well this season. Hoping he can play 25 to 30 minutes here tonight. He's averaging 1.01 fantasy points per minute. So if he can play 30 minutes, gives him a really good shot at getting 30 fantasy points and getting value. So I like Norman Powell in a great matchup here versus the San Antonio Spurs.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And then we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, another shooting guard that I like, also eligible at the small forward position. This is a sleeper pick or a value play. I like Isaac Okoro from the Cleveland Cavaliers, playing the Houston Rockets, who have the 4th worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Isaac Okoro has scored 24, 22, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 24, and 21 minutes. Now, this is my projection here, and it's definitely this projection might be a little bit high, but I've got him projected at 22 fantasy points here tonight. It's a great matchup. He's playing 24 to 30 minutes the last 2 games, so let's see, he's averaging 0.68 fantasy points per minute. So if he can play 30 minutes here tonight, he should be able to hit 20 fantasy points and get you well over 5 times value. He's only $3,600 DraftKings salary. He is $1,000 more on FanDuel, so I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 223 points scored in this game. So if he does reach my projected 22 fantasy points, that's 6.1 times value. And remember, he scored 24 and 22 fantasy points in the last 2 games. And he's got a great matchup here tonight. So I think he can get over 20 fantasy points and crush value. So I like Isaac Okoro here versus the Houston Rockets. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. Stud on the slate that I love is Paul George from the LA Clippers, playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Paul George has averaged 42.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 30% usage rate. He's projected at 42.3 fantasy points here tonight. That's his season average, and that's 5 times value because he's $8,500 DraftKings salary, $300 less on FanDuel. So I love that FanDuel price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game. And Paul George has scored 46, 35, and 42 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 36, 34, and 31 minutes. Now we know Paul George has 50 plus fantasy point upside, especially in a fantastic matchup in what's supposed to be a high scoring game. So this is like a no-brainer stud for me here. Everything is aligning or matching up, or the stars are aligning here for Paul George here versus the San Antonio Spurs. Okay, so another small forward that I like, I think he's a good mid-range value play here. Take a look at Jalen McDaniels from the Charlotte Hornets, playing the Chicago Bulls, who have the 10th worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Jalen McDaniels has averaged 23.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with a 17% usage rate. He's projected at 22.6 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 28 fantasy points or more, get you over 5 times value. He's 5,200 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel, so I prefer that DraftKings price. And Jalen McDaniels has scored 36, 27, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 28, and 24 minutes. So playing a lot of minutes the last 2 games. It's not a back-to-back, so he's fresh and good to go in what should be a fast-paced game and a good matchup. So I like Jalen McDaniels here versus the Chicago Bulls. Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. Here's a stud that I like. I like Kawhi Leonard from the LA Clippers playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Kawhi Leonard has averaged 37.2 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 27% usage rate, but he's playing a lot more minutes recently and his production is way up. So he's projected at 49 fantasy points here tonight. That's just about 5 times value. He needs exactly 50 fantasy points to get you 5 times value. He's 10,000 DraftKings salary, 500 less on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game. And Kawhi Leonard has scored 48, 49, and 57 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And he played 35, 38, and 38 minutes. So I like Kawhi Leonard here versus the San Antonio Spurs. Oh, and Kawhi Leonard scored 57 fantasy points in his last game versus the Spurs. I've been forgetting to give you these numbers. Let me just go back real quick. Let me give you these numbers, the team, player versus team history. So Jalen McDaniels scored 35 and 31 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Bulls. I'm just going to go back and do this real quick for all the players. Norman Powell, he scored 36 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Spurs. We got Kawhi Leonard, just gave you him. Let's go back to the shooting guard position. Sorry, I got to remember to do this because it is important to get your team versus player matchup. Like, look at this one. For Malcolm Brogdon, one of the reasons that I like Malcolm Brogdon here tonight is he scored 32, 35, 43, and 38 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Knicks. So that's fantastic. Spencer Dinwiddie has played good against the Suns. We already gave you him. I remembered. Isaac Okoro, he scored 20 and 27 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Rockets. Remember, he'll get well over 5 times value even if he reaches just 20 fantasy points. So he's in a good spot. Okay, so sorry about that. Back to Kawhi Leonard. So you could play Kawhi Leonard or you could play Paul George. Now, I prefer Paul George, but I do think Kawhi Leonard has a good chance at hitting value here tonight. I think he can put up over 50 fantasy points. And if you really want to get risky, you could stack Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. Both of those guys could have a phenomenal game here tonight. It could be a good stack in what should be a high-scoring game against a bad defense. So I like Kawhi Leonard here versus the San Antonio Spurs.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, moving on to the center position. I would like Nicholas Claxton, but he's on a back-to-back, but he's got a good matchup. He looks underpriced for his minutes and his production. So even on a back-to-back, he could be worth playing. Let's just take a look at his score log, and let's see how he's done on previous back-to-backs. Not a lot of them here. We got to go all the way back. Geez, they haven't played a lot of back-to-backs. Oh my gosh. Okay, so here's one earlier in the season. Trailblazers, he played 31 minutes, and then the next game versus the Magic, he played 36 minutes, and he scored 41.8 fantasy points. So, looks like you don't have to worry about the back-to-back minutes here with Nicholas Claxton. So if that's the case, I like Nicholas Claxton from the Brooklyn Nets playing the Detroit Pistons, who have the second worst defense overall, give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Nicholas Claxton has averaged 32.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. Now he's projected at 40 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.3 times value. He's 7,600 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 231.5 points scored in this game. And Nicholas Claxton has scored 47, 51, and 35 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 38, 36, and 37 minutes. So you can see monster minutes and monster production. Looks a little bit underpriced for those recent numbers and a good matchup. So I like Nicholas Claxton here versus the Detroit Pistons. Now, a stud that I think is pretty safe here tonight, take a look at Nikolai Vucevic from the Chicago Bulls playing the Charlotte Hornets, who have the second worst defense overall, give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing centers. Nikolai Vucevic has averaged 40.2 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 21% usage rate. Now, the low projection here at only 38.5 fantasy points, I think he can score 45 fantasy points or more. Let's see what value that is. So that's 5 times value. He's 9,000 DraftKings salary, 600 less on FanDuel. And Nikola Vucevic has scored 41, 49, and 46 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 38, and 35 minutes. Now, versus the Hornets, last 2 games not so good, 37 and 16. But the 3 games before that scored 54, 63, and 61 fantasy points. So I like Nikola Vucevic here versus the Charlotte Hornets. Now, if you want to save some salary at the center position, take a look at Jarrett Allen from the Cleveland Cavaliers playing the Houston Rockets, who have the 4th worst defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing centers. Jarrett Allen has averaged 32.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He's projected at 30.2 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 35 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. He's 6,500 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel, so I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 223 points scored in this game, and Jarrett Allen has scored 43, 28, and 27 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 38, 27, and 31 minutes. He's got kind of a mixed history here versus the Rockets. Scored 23, 26, 33, 61, and 36 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Rockets. So I think he's somewhat of a high-risk, high-reward play here. Kind of looks like he's boom or bust. But I think he's a good price tag on DraftKings. Wouldn't play him on FanDuel. But I think he only needs like 33 fantasy points or 34 fantasy points to get you 5 times value on DraftKings. Let's see what his value would be if he gets 34 fantasy points. That would be 5.2 times value. Then he does have 40 plus fantasy point upside. So I think he's a decent play here tonight. So I like Jarrett Allen here versus the Houston Rockets. Now, if you're looking for a value play or a sleeper pick, take a look at Zach Collins from the San Antonio Spurs playing the LA Clippers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Zach Collins has averaged 22 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 21 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. He's projected at 20.3 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.5 times value. Only $3,700 DraftKings salary. Now he's $1,600 more on FanDuel, so I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game, and Zach Collins has scored 31, 18, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So he's been on fire, playing 24, 21, and 24 minutes. Now it is a back-to-back, but his DraftKings price is so low here, and he's consistently been playing over 20 minutes a game, averaging 1.1 fantasy points per minute. So I love this value play, so I like Zach Collins on DraftKings here versus the LA Clippers.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.